All right, ready to dig in? Yeah, let's go. All righty. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Emma, one of the librarians here at Rockland Public Library, and we are so thrilled to be hosting tonight's talk. I'm going to jump right into it after first introducing the next couple events coming up at the library. Next Thursday on the 19th at 6:30, we're going to be having a reading room concert, the first one we've had in years, with Abigail Nash on violin. She is fantastic, and we are so looking forward to her. And then the week after that, we'll be back downstairs in the community room for on the 26th at 6:30 for Caring for a Loved One with Alzheimer's, a talk by poet Gary Rainford, who is also fantastic. And then I'm going to say that for those of us joining on Zoom in either, I think it's that camera actually, who are interested in participating in the discussion, you're welcome to chime in. Please use the raise hand feature, and I will then unmute you and we can add you right on. We actually have you on the screen here so we can see you pop up and ask your question or join in the discussion. Hello. And then for those of us joining in person, if you'd like to chime in, I have this handheld mic, which will let the Zoom people hear you as well. And now I'm going to introduce tonight's speaker. Gretchen Legler is a farmer, gardener, teacher, writer, and lover of the natural world. Her 3-book-length works of literary nonfiction include All the Powerful Things, On the Ice, and Woodsqueer. Her writing has won numerous awards, including Pushcart prizes, a notable essay in Best American Essays, and has been published in venues including Orion and The Georgia Review. She teaches creative writing in English at the University of Maine at Farmington, where she is also the director of the campus and community garden. And I will turn it right over to Gretchen. Go right ahead. Woo.
Thank you, Em. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. So it's so great to be at a wonderful library, and so much happens in libraries. This is just one of the things that happens in libraries. So thank you, M Lewis, for making this happen, and to all the other staff at this wonderful library. It just feels like such an expansive, safe, and beautiful space. And shout out to librarians worldwide for for the lives they save and the way they help us come together as community. And thank you, all of you too, for coming out tonight. It's just cold and dark out there. So to get out of the house and to come out and be a part of something public I know it takes an effort. And we all know how important community is. So especially after COVID, when we were missing it so much. So it's just great to be again in a place where readers and writers and books and all those great things come together in one place. So I'm really delighted to be here. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit, read a little bit, talk a little bit, read a little bit, and then just have a conversation. And I'm imagining many of you are writers or would like to be writers, or have written about rural life, or maybe you're artists of some kind. And I find that rural life offers such a wonderful lens and so many wonderful lessons for thinking about what it is to be a human being and live this life. So I want to just talk a little bit about the writing life and rural life and how this book came to be. And then I'll read from the title essay, Woodsqueer, where your question will be answered about where the title came from. So the book is a collection of essays, and I love the essay form. My other books are also collections of essays. They come together one essay at a time, because I love to think within the confines of an essay. And then pretty soon I'll have 5 or 6 essays, or maybe 7 or 8 essays that seem to have a common theme, right? Because that's what I'm obsessed with at the time. So then I start thinking about the possibility of those essays coming together in the form of a book. And when that happens, the next step is to try to get in touch with a publisher, try to find an agent if you need an agent, or try to find a publisher who might be interested in your work. And I've been lucky enough to have 3 terrific small press publishers in my life. One was Seal Press, which is a small feminist press in the Seattle area, and they're no longer around. They sold themselves to another press. And then the other press was Milkweed Press, which is in Minneapolis, also a small press, really focused on, one of their focuses is writing about the natural world. And then the other press that published this book is Trinity University Press, which is also a press that is focused on memoir and nonfiction writing about the natural world. So I've been very lucky to work with editors at these small presses. So probably in my writing life, I will never write a book that will be published by a big fancy New York publisher, and nor will I make any money writing. But so I finally come to terms with that. But that's not why most of the writers I know write. They don't write to make money. They write for a bunch of different reasons, one of which is that that's just what they feel they were born to do. And if they don't do it, something feels wrong in their lives. So I'm always writing about my life. So this book took a long time in the making, and it's a very strange thing to be writing memoir and to be writing about your life, and trying to write a book about a certain time in your life. And it almost feels to me that like that time has to be over before I have enough perspective to look back on it and reflect on it enough to tell the story in a meaningful way. So this book didn't come together until my life on the farm that this book is about was really over. But that's not to say that we were just talking a little bit earlier about the different iterations of farm life that can now take place in my strange little rural suburban house in Farmington, Maine. So the book took a long time to write. My partner and I moved to Maine in 2000 from Alaska, where we had been living for 6 years. And so I came to Maine in 2000, started writing in 2000. And this book really started coming together around 2015. So that's a long time. And I think books like this take a long time. Like I said, you have to live the life and write about the life, and then you have to be able to reflect on what you've done. So as one of my writing, I am good friends with the former Maine poet laureate Wes McNair, and he was always trying to make me feel better about being such a slow writer. But that's what he said. He said, you're not one of those people who rushes into print, Gretchen, and that's a good thing. So what is the book about? In most of the nonfiction writing I've done, I like to think that what I'm doing is I'm paying attention to exterior landscapes, the world around me, and I'm trying to weave those exterior landscapes into what's happening in my own life, in my interior landscape. And I caught on to this idea of this weaving together of interior and exterior landscapes from this gorgeous essay by Barry Lopez, who is one of my writing mentors and one of my mentors in thinking about human relationships to landscape. And it was an essay he wrote called Story at Anektovik Pass, and which was later revamped into an essay called Landscape and Narrative. And he very firmly believes that this weaving of interior landscapes and exterior landscapes happens in our lives, and is one of the ways to make sense out of our relationship with place. So there are stories in here about mine and my partner's very intimate life, our coming together, our having our first commitment ceremony, our relationship almost falling apart because one of us had an affair, the death of my parents, trying to get pregnant, sperm arriving at the door in a little dry ice capsule. So all kinds of intimate details about our life, and a lot of reflection on my own family history and wounds from family history and trying to heal from those wounds. And then there are stories about what it's like to heat with wood and various ways to make a wood pile, various ways to make elegant wood piles, how to skin a beaver hide and milk a goat, and what it's like to grow your own flock of chickens and then be responsible for butchering them. So all kinds of interesting essays about the ins and outs of rural life. So I'd like to start by reading you the title. Oh, let me, just before I start, I want to also say that the book is illustrated, and I'm the unlikely illustrator of this book. And what happened was that I wrote this essay about wood piles, about various ways to stack wood. I'll see if I can find it and show you the picture. Just for kicks. And then when I sent this book off to the publisher, they said, "Oh, you're an artist." I said, "Well, not exactly. I can draw wood in a pile." So they said, "We'd like you to illustrate this book." So I took that challenge, and the reason I took the challenge is because some of my favorite books about the natural world are these old-fashioned illustrated books like Henry Beston's work, or it's not, the others aren't coming to me right now, but these sort of 1950s, 60s, 70s works that are illustrated with pen and ink. Those of you who know Bernd Heinrich's work, he also writes, many books about the natural world, and he also illustrates them in pen and ink. And there's something so satisfying and elegant and old-fashioned about that. So, okay, so this is the title essay, Woodsqueer. Woodsqueer 1, because there's also another essay in the book called Woodsqueer, but that's called Woodsqueer 2. So here we go. The cabin sat in a dark green glen along what was once the main trail to Mount Blue, shaded by second growth Maine pines, hemlock, and birch, within easy earshot of a bubbling stream that hikers, led there by the old trail, once stopped beside for rest and water. The hiking trail up this popular mountain in western Maine, however, had long since been rerouted, and now the derelict log cabin with its falling-in tar paper roof and leaf-strewn porch was hunkered down in the woods just off a short, barely trodden spur path. My partner Ruth and I had recently moved to Maine from Alaska, where we'd spent the first 2 years of our couplehood, me teaching at the University of Alaska Anchorage and Ruth working as an electrician and fire alarm technician. In Maine, we'd bought 80 acres of wooded land with a house and barn-like shed, and had launched ourselves into growing our own food, something we'd both done before we met, but put our backs into now with renewed effort as a couple, hoping that our gardens would grow to provide us our own food year-round. I suppose you could call it homesteading, but with none of the sod busting and wilderness taming of times gone by. In the 1970s, it was called going back to the land, when waves of urban-born, politically motivated young people moved to rural Maine, inspired by the likes of Helen and Scott Nearing and their book, Living the Good Life, How to Live Sanely and Simply in a Troubled World. The book chronicled the couple's move to rural Maine in 1932 and their 20 years restoring soil, gardening, farming, and engaging in political activism on behalf of the earth. Ruth and I were both fascinated by people who chose to live close to nature. So of course we couldn't resist taking the detour off the hiking trail to look at this little ramshackle cabin. We were hiking with Ruth's sister and her husband and a 9-year-old summer guest who was visiting us from Manhattan as part of the Fresh Air Project, which had been bringing city kids to the woods for more than 100 years. We all trooped into the woods to take a closer look at what had apparently once been the forest ranger's residence. What we saw were piles of dirt and leaves blown into the corners, spider webs hanging from the beams, a stained mattress and some squirrel had pulled apart for a warm winter nest, a torn shirt, or maybe it was a pair of pants in a rotten pile, a rusted wood stove, a pot with a hole in it, a broken down bookshelf, a wooden chair with only 2 legs, and some beer bottles and hamburger bags. Too bad. It seemed like once upon a time it had been a sweet place. Back on the trail, 2 hikers came sweating up behind us, exclaiming loudly, "I knew that old cabin was here somewhere." The pair was an older woman and a younger one, maybe a mother and daughter. The older of the 2, huffing and puffing, said she had hiked this mountain many times in her younger days and remembered the old trail going by the stream and past the cabin door so that you could have a chat with the ranger, if the ranger was in, that is, and not on the rocky windswept top of the 3,000-foot mountain in the fire tower, watching closely for puffs of smoke from the dark, rolling ranges of tree and rock that stretched out for many miles in all directions. While we rested companionably beside the trail, we got to talking about living in the woods. Living in the woods and a cabin such as the abandoned one behind us was not hard to imagine. Sweep it out, seal the cracks, haul up a cot and a table, install a little glass cook stove, put a pump in that would bring the stream right to your countertop, light the wood stove, and magically you would have a cozy place to live, away from the noise of cars and sirens, machines in general, and people. In my youth, I had stayed for summers in places like this when I worked for the U.S. Forest Service in Utah and Wyoming. All my life, I had wanted to live in a cabin in the woods, just like this one. I often felt I should have been born in a different time, when things were slower, when people traveled by horse, by boat, on foot, sent letters, went to bed when it got dark, grew their own food, kept diaries, danced, and made music for entertainment. I looked longingly at the derelict cabin and said, that would have been a nice place to be a forest ranger. Ruth and I told the hikers about a friend of ours who had lived in the woods for 8 years, keeping watch from a fire tower at Allagash Lake in Maine's Allagash Wilderness. This was one of the first things we learned about our friend Marilyn, and something that impressed us deeply. Anyone who could do that, anyone who could live alone in the woods for 8 years, was a person with inner resources beyond those available to many of us. For a while, Ruth and I, our hiking companions and our trail mates, debated the merits of such a life as the one lived in the rustic cabin beside the stream. We sipped our water and snacked on crackers and raisins. "Well," one of the women said as we set off again, "I don't know about you, but I think I'd go a little soft in the head if it was me. You know, I'd go, what was it they used to say? What was it they used to call people who lived in the woods too long?" She paused and then suddenly recalled the term, Woodsqueer. I looked at Ruth and she at me, and we smiled at one another over those 2 lovely words joined together. So that is where the title of the book came from. And in researching the word Woodsqueer, apparently it was in common usage as, you know, a way to describe people who are just, spent too long in the woods. They supposedly went a little crazy. But of course, it serves multiple purposes for this book, because this book is also about being a lesbian couple in rural Maine and living that life. So let's see. I talked a little bit about some of the what some of the essays are about in the book. And one of the things that I learned a long time ago from another writing mentor, Patricia Hampel, who is a a memoir writer and was a teacher of mine. She always used to talk about her books of memoir having a narrative arc. So they were made up of essays, but they made a story, they made an arc like this. And I always think of it visually like this. So the arcs in this book include ideas, themes, like what does it mean how do you know when you found a place to call home? How do you know when you're ready to settle into a landscape, into a relationship? Let's see, what are some of the other themes? What is wealth? How do we know when we have enough? That's another theme. Another theme is attention to the natural world. I love this line from poet Mary Oliver from her book Upstream. She says, attention is the beginning of devotion. And I feel like that's one of the things that I was trying to do in this book, was just to pay attention and to write lovingly about animals and plants and rocks and trees and soil and whatever I could get my hand on. Again, healing is one of the narrative arcs in this book. And I'm going to read you from an essay called Foragers about coming to the table in terms of the spirit and in terms of the body, and the table being nature's table, or not only nature's table, but the life that is available to all of us in community, coming to the table, coming to a place of belonging. Let's see. Also, there's another theme in here about confronting the violence of rural life, whether that means eating meat or injuring yourself in farm accidents or rural accidents, the everyday the deaths that can occur on a farm through no one's fault, but also the process of killing your own animals to eat. So coming to terms with that, wondering about it and asking questions about it. So I want to read you a little bit from an essay called Wealthy. And so I write about my own life a lot in this book, but I also wanted to write about my rural neighbors. So this is an essay about a man named Francis Fenton, who he's passed now, but he had an apple orchard in Mercer, Maine, which is not far outside of Farmington. And Francis grew, I think, 90 varieties of apples in his orchard, which is something that just isn't done today. And so I would go to Francis's orchard as often as I could, and I started bringing my students there. So I want to read you a little bit of a story about Francis and his orchard. And you'll see why the essay is called Wealthy. Word of mouth brought me to Francis Fenton's extraordinary orchard, where I encountered a universe of apples presided over by a spry, loquacious old man whose entire life, give or take a few years, had been devoted to these fabulous, mythic, and entirely ordinary fruits of the earth. I sensed during that first visit that I should get to know Francis a bit better, and that I should bring my students to him as well, and that he knew things we all should know. At Sandy River Apples in Mercer, Maine, we would walk among the trees, guided by Francis, and collect apples that we made into cider using an old-fashioned press. Francis is dead now. No person, like no apple tree, can live forever. But like Francis's spirit and wisdom, small branches can be grafted from one apple tree to another, and in that way, some part of the life goes on and on and on. It was on an August afternoon, many years after my first meeting with Francis, that he came back to mind. I decided to finally bottle the Applejack, or alcoholic cider, that Ruth and I had begun 8 months earlier. The cider making process had begun on a sunny fall day in our front yard. Overflowing bushel baskets of apples sat under the spreading branches of the beech tree, while nearby, upright on its wooden legs, was an old-fashioned cider press in which we crushed the apples and extracted their juice. And then there's a whole description of how the cider press works, and I'm going to skip over that. Perhaps it isn't fair to say the cider making started with the pressing. It actually began with the apples, which we collected in huge grain bags in Francis's orchard, him shaking the trees with a long hooked pole, the apples thudding to the ground, us ducking and dodging out of the way as they came raining down like fantastic red and gold treasure. Francis, who inherited the orchard from his father, William Fenton, who inherited from his father, Frank Fenton, who bought the farm from the first settlers in 1852, was one of Western Maine's most respected and beloved apple men. Bucking the current market system that favored only a handful of shippable varieties of apples, McIntosh, Cortland, Granny Smith, and the like, Francis grew upward of 143 varieties. I guess my memory didn't serve me well, including at least one he invented himself, quote unquote invented. It was called the Dolly Delicious, a yellow thin-skinned apple that wasn't too tart, named after his late wife, whose delicate constitution favored a sweeter, less acidic fruit. On Francis's advice, Ruth and I mixed at least 7 apple varieties for our cider, combining sweet with tart for ultimate flavor. If Francis was making the fresh cider not to be fermented like ours, he'd often throw in a bright red beet as well, turning the juice a golden red and adding an earthy richness. The cider recipe Ruth and I chose was as old and simple as the apple press, as ancient as the making of alcohol itself. We invited wild yeasts to do the work of fermentation, just as Ruth's cider drinking New England ancestors might have done. One of the reasons bottling the cider rose to the top of my list on that August day was that seasonal cues, cooler nights, the sight of green apples dangling from neighborhood trees, ripened winter squash, the chirp of crickets in the dry grass, fresh local corn for sale by the roadside. All of those cues reminded me that apple season would soon be upon us again. Soon we would be visiting Francis again, collecting bulging bags of Romes and Cortlands, Macoons and Spies. Soon it would all begin again, just like the year before. I wanted to pay the apples a certain respect and complete the process we'd begun. After all, so much had been invested, so much time and labor had gone into the cider already. Visits to Francis's orchard always included a tour, where he named each tree as he loped along, dodging in and out of the grassy rows. As he passed a tree, he'd impart some wisdom and opinion on the uses of its fruit. Gotta eat that before the sundown, it'll rot on the tree. I don't do the Maine accent very well. Some history of its growth. Grafted that in 77, and related or not, observations about contemporary life. Remember, always go away from the table hungry. That's the trouble with American people. They eat like pigs. In his mile a minute, slightly slurred, spit moistened speech, he'd tell his guests, that's an old tree. My father planted that tree 100 years ago. That tree is 100 years old, a century old. That's a wealthy. This was all wealthies. My father cleared all this land and planted it to wealthies 100 years ago. But when I came back from the Navy, the pines, you see, had taken over. See, all this out here was pines with apples growing in them. So I cleared it again and planted all these different kinds. I got so many, I don't remember them all. Francis grew up in the modest white house next to the white barn with its huge hand-hewn hemlock beams, which stood next to the long white apple shed with a big smiling dancing apple painted on the side. I was born in that house. I guess I'll die in it, he'd say. Up until about 1940, life was okay for Francis out there in the woods and fields. Then things sort of went to pot. All the guys left. They went out west. After World War II, everyone left. I even left myself. A connoisseur of labor is what Francis is, someone who paid close attention to the ways physical effort produced things of value and the ways the ratio of effort to value changed over time. It took hard work, real labor, to replant the apple orchard after the pines had moved in, the kind of labor that is unfamiliar to many of us today, what you'd call backbreaking. I know some of you know what that is. So when I say many of us, I'm not talking about you all. Francis again. My age, see, my age is the machine age. But before that, back then they made powerful men, men who could eat a big bowl of cornmeal mush for breakfast and then go out and work all day, cutting down trees, taking big chips out. I tried that with an axe and it looks like a beaver had been in it. In those days, they'd work at it and a big chip would fly right out. Cornmeal mush for breakfast and another bowl at dinner, and they'd go to bed and get up and do it all again. My father had either a spade handle or an axe handle in his hands all his life. Those men, powerful men. They'd shave off calluses with a jackknife. Those were some powerful men. Each tree in Francis's orchard was labeled. Some tags were metal and had grown into the thick bark, while others were plastic bands with the apple variety recorded with fading black marker and Francis's arthritic scrawl. He didn't need the labels, of course. He knew his trees without their name tags. Black Oxford, Macintosh, Connell Red, Spy, remember Pie, Spy, Pie, he'd say, Ida Red, Dolly Delicious. Now that was my favorite, my wife's favorite apple. See, she's dead now. I grafted that one and named it after her. That's the only apple she could eat. See, nice and sweet, you know, without that acidity. Harrelson, Honeygold, Jonathan, McCoon, Northern Greening, Sweet 16, Tolman Sweet 20 ounce, Wolf River, Golden Delicious, Follow Water, Baldwin. Now that's a Maine apple, a keeper. That's good for midwinter. Gala, Empire, Arkansas Black, Ben Davis, shipped those clear over to England back in the day. Cortland, Halverson, Cox Orange Pippin, an old folks apple. New Delicious, Astrakhan, Fireside, Russet, them's good winter apples, but I don't think much of them. Rome, Sheep's Nose, Black Gilliflower, Spitzbergen, that was Thomas Jefferson's favorite apple. Blue Pearmain, Thompson, Snow, Honeycrisp, Yellow Delicious, Vista Bell, Wagoner, Spencer, Red Cortland, Pewaukee, Paula Red, Milton, Rogers, Golden Russet, Tiedemann, Hazen, Smokehouse, Winter Banana, Whitney, Wine-Kissed, Winesap, Wealthy, Wealthy, Wealthy. So Francis goes on talking about his apples, and I love lists of names, as you can tell. But I want to read you the last paragraph in this. After my last visit with Francis, I bought him a pie as thanks, made from the Wealthies I'd collected the year before and had peeled, sliced, and put in bags in the freezer, mixed with sugar, cinnamon, and lemon so I could easily dump the fruit into a crust and bake a fresh pie. I delivered this out-of-season treat to Francis on a hot May afternoon while he was resting at the counter in his old farmhouse, eating his ice cream and applesauce. Ice cream and applesauce, that's what I attribute my longevity to. Every day, gotta have it. As I handed him the pie, his eyes grew wide. By golly, that's a big pie. That's a right size pie. I'll have to save that for when my daughter comes in September. I must have looked alarmed, knowing the pie fruit had already spent 7 months in the freezer. And of course, the pie wouldn't last until fall when his daughter traveled from California to Maine to help with the apple harvest. But I was relieved when he added, I'll put it in the freezer and save a piece for her. I can't eat that whole pie. That's a big pie, by golly, a full-size pie. As I left through the mudroom, closing the creaky screen door, he was still offering his thanks. By golly, such a big pie. My word, you can't buy a pie like that. So there's a bit of a passage in this essay about, you know, contemplating wealth, what wealth means. And for someone who lives a rural life and has a farm and has a garden and has a barn and has chickens and has goats or a cow, or we have what we need, you know, and what many other people in many other parts of the world would think of as true wealth, as opposed to this other thing that I have, which is this money in the stock market, which goes up and down and up and down and just feels so diaphanous, right? And potentially unreal. Let's see, I'd like to I'd like to read just a little bit more from the essay at the end, near the end, called Foragers. And many of you are probably foragers. You go out into the woods, and maybe you find mushrooms, maybe you find rose hips, maybe you find ramps, or what else is out there? What else do you poke around in the wood? Okay, yes, okay, down here, yeah, you guys get stuff like that. You get fish, you get oysters. What else? Chaga mushrooms, um, um, berries, dandelion greens. What other kinds of greens are out there? Fiddleheads, thank you. I don't know why I'm blanking on all this. Yes, there's a lot out there to find in the woods. Oh, of course, acorns. Have any of you ever made acorns into flour? Yeah, wonderful process. So this is called Foragers, and it's sort of a love letter to Yule Gibbons, who was a childhood hero of mine. So, and this is a poem that Yule Gibbons wrote. Who knew that he was a poet? The high bush cranberries red above the snow, the sharpest, brightest flavor that I know, a hint of bitter harmonized with sour. And for this treat, I beg you, spare the flower that decorates the woods in spring. If you can learn to give each thing your loving reverence, you will be able to dine with me at Mother Nature's table. We'll laugh at all the winter winds that blow when high bush cranberries hang above the snow. So how many of you know who Yule Gibbons is? Great, okay. So those of you who don't, you'll find out about him in this essay. Yule Gibbons, one of the world's most famous foragers, was one of my childhood superheroes. I was a kid starving for replacement father figures, and this one promised to educate me in a crucial skill, how to survive alone in the wild. My first encounters with Gibbons were when my brothers and sister and I sat glued to the television screen on Saturday mornings, an icon of the 1960s Back to Nature movement. Gibbons is the man most of us know as the face of post-grape nut cereal. But more importantly, he's the author of many classic nature texts, the first one of which was Stalking the Wild Asparagus. The cereal commercials made an impression on me as a kid. Here was what seemed to be a fatherly fellow in a plaid shirt, out among the cattails, munching from a bowl of what looked like tiny pebbles. In one commercial, Gibbons hangs out in an old flour mill in the Ozarks. In another, he watches a Zuni elder pound corn. In another, he's picking wild high bush cranberries in the winter to add to his cereal. Ruth and I are both foragers. It's been one of the delights and cornerstones of our relationship. One day, slowing our car to a crawl in order to maneuver between the two huge granite boulders that squatted like friendly sentinels on either side of the rutted dirt road leading to our one-room camp in Chesterville, Maine, I saw an odd shape attached to a tree. It was mid-June, early in the season for mushrooms, and there, beside the road, attached in a voluptuous silver-white cascade to the trunk of a dead maple, were oyster mushrooms. Imagine soft, glimmering clamshells, one cream-colored, delicately gilled underside, artfully overlapping the next velvet, smooth, cloud-tinted cap. When fresh, they smell sweetly of oyster, which is even more prominent when they're cooked. We'd encountered oyster mushrooms before, but we were hesitant to try them. Finally, over years of encounters and research, we'd come to trust our knowledge of this fleshy, scalloped beauty, which we most often harvested from beech trees in the fall. I stopped the car, hopped out to collect a sample, and brought it home to identify. It turned out to be Pleurotus populinus, the late spring and early summer oyster. We sliced it up and included it in our next breakfast omelet, toasting across the table with our coffee cups, giving thanks to one another and to Mother Nature for this wild fruit of the forest. Yule Gibbons, though, didn't just teach me how to survive in the metaphoric wilderness of life, wasn't just teaching me how to survive in the metaphorical wilderness of life. His broad-chested back to the land oneness with nature inspired trust. And while I sought self-sufficiency on the one hand, I also sought a relationship with someone who could father me, mother me, teach me gently about connection, love, safety, and how to feel at home in the world. So Ruth and I have expanded our foraging to include a lot of different mushrooms, which we feel more confident about these days. And I've always got my eye out for stuff around campus, my campus in Farmington, so that I can take students on a little walk and show them all the things to eat that are out there. And so I often play this game, which is if I got stuck here and didn't have any money and had to eat, what could I possibly find to eat? So I play this little game with myself. And this game, this game is endlessly amusing to me. So this essay is in part a meditation on what it means to be self-sufficient, what it means to think that you can do everything by yourself. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit here and read you from the end of the book. Although the forager game continues to amuse me, I've come to a new understanding of self-sufficiency. While knowing how to fend for yourself is extremely useful, it can, if engaged in obsessively, be another way to make yourself lonely. I will run away. I will take care of myself is the child's way, the injured psyche's way of staying safe, but ideally only until a new home and a new community can be found. I've found that new community in many places. On the farm in Western Maine that I built with Ruth, in the homes of dear friends, in the woods, in volunteering as a chaplain at our local hospital, often in the offices of therapists and other healers, and oddly enough for me, in the pews of a church. Going to church opened a door to a deep longing that I continue to explore. In the beginning, one of the hardest things for me was communion. It took me years to gather the courage to join other parishioners as they walked forward down the aisle to the communion table, to lift a cube of bread or tear off a piece of a fresh loaf, dip the bread into a cup of grape juice, and receive from the pastor a version of the following blessing: the bread of life for you and the cup of blessings. It's hard to articulate why I was so afraid to join, and what I know now is a symbolic ritual meal, a sharing of love and food. I think my fear had to do with letting myself become a part of something bigger than me, a spirit of love. I was being offered an opportunity, at least metaphorically, to be a precious invited guest at a table that everyone else was also welcome at. We are all the same. No one had to prove he or she was worthy to sit at this table. No one was more or less welcome than any other. I was being invited to let go of my ego, to put down my burdens, and let someone or something else feed me. The simple hymn we sang while communion was in process often brought me to tears. Come to the table of grace. Come to the table of grace. This is God's table. It's not yours or mine. Come to the table of grace. The kindest, most generous words anyone had ever said to me were, "You are not alone. There is an end to your suffering and you are not alone." Those words weren't offered in a religious context, although that might be a familiar understanding for many of how God might be understood, as always being so near that we're never without comfort, never far from a loving presence. The words were offered instead in a therapist's office when I expressed a desperate feeling of loneliness and despair. "You're not alone," she said. "Do you mean I'm not alone because I have friends, or because I have Ruth, or because of God, or because you're here right now?" I asked. "All of that," she said. "All of that." Such a simple offering, the solid presence of another human being who is listening with attention and love. I trusted this person as I trusted Yule Gibbons as a girl, as I trusted Ruth, as I trusted the plants that I found as I foraged in our yard, in our woods, and in the lakes and ponds and mountains and roadsides of my new home. I was never alone. I had never been alone. I know that now in my bones. I swim in a sea of relations with people dead and alive, with powerful forces I can't see or understand, and with every single living organism on this earth. I have come to the table, to Mother Nature's table, to the table of grace. What I forage for now is something both ineffable and real. I suppose you could call my foraging a hobby and be done with it, although the word hobby has a slightly pejorative whiff to it. I prefer to think of foraging as a spiritual calling, a way to practice gratitude, a way to become acquainted with the vast and intricate beauty of the world, a way to pray. So I would love, in the time that we have, and I think, do you go to 7:30 or 7?
7:30, okay. We close at 8, so we want to be done by like
Okay,
4.
yeah. So we have lots of time to talk, which is really my favorite thing to do, not read or talk at, but talk with. So thanks for listening to that. Yeah, hi.
Start with a quick question.
Yes,
This is just an easy question, but
Good.
had you not heard the term Woodsqueer before that moment on the hike?
I had not.
Oh. Interesting.
Had you heard, had you been familiar with that word?
I think I was slightly familiar with it, but I just read 9 Mile Bridge recently, and the author, I've forgotten her name, she wrote that term that they used among trappers that were out in the woods too long.
Oh,
So I
interesting.
kind of re-encountered it the last month. but
So what's 9 Mile Bridge?
gosh, can anyone help me out? It was a woman that lived with her husband up on the St. John River. He was a game warden, and she lived in the woods there for like 3 years with them. I can't remember her name
You
now,
got
but
it. Okay.
it was a
good.
Maine author. So
Yeah, wonderful.
I got to give this to somebody else.
Yeah. I also heard this reference to the term that there were some college kids from the city who came to Maine and went out to one of those camps. And then when they came back, they'd all gone a little Woodsqueer. Yeah. It's a great term. And I wonder, what does it mean exactly? Does it mean that that you're now unused to the ways of city life? Does it mean that you've had a readjustment in your value system? Does it mean you can't stand to hear traffic noise anymore? You know, I think in some way, anybody who's spent any amount of time living in a rural environment is a little Woodsqueer, right? Because then you go get on the freeway and you think, oh my God, the world is so crazy. Where did all these people come from? These cars are all driving so fast. So we're all a little Woodsqueer.
It makes me think of Tom Hanks in the movie where he's on the island. He starts, his best friend is the volleyball player, and he's talking to us.
Got it. Yeah, we start talking to trees. Yeah, we start thanking mushrooms when we pick them. Yeah.
When I heard the word, or when I read it, the word Woodsqueer, I'd never heard it before, but it reminded me when I was in college of a guy that I waited tables with who had gotten back from hiking the Appalachian Trail, and he was silent except when he was taking orders. And I asked him, where his voice had gone, and he said that he left it on the trail and he just was overwhelmed with the world. And that he preferred the quiet in his mind that he got when he was on the trail to all of this when he was back in a urban area.
Mhm.
So he made more sense to me when I read that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's that gift too of rural life. Less noise. Yeah.
I don't know if this question, it might be uncomfortable for you. Are you okay with that?
Yes,
Okay.
I like being uncomfortable.
I guess I'm trying to just see what there is to learn from, thinking about my experience rurally here and your experience as you've narrated it so far. And I'm wondering, I live in the woods. I don't have utilities. I have a rental. I've been renting in the woods without utilities, like a couple different places for 3 years in this area. It's been really difficult. It's been really difficult to like have a job at the same time. I think it's like a myth to believe that, in my experience, it's a myth to believe that you can live off the land without having some either magical inherited source of money or something that's supporting you, because capitalism is still real, even living in the woods with like barely any bills. I still need cars to always be functioning to survive, and I still need my cell phone. Never mind what is required to have a job. So I'm just wondering how that worked out for you, how you like navigated that, because I do think when I hear other people talk about living rurally, sometimes it is like kind of a mythological time of like reconnecting to nature and being centered, and I guess there's an element of class that feels like it really informs what living rurally means for different people, and privilege and access, and even just like a life of, say working in the trades is physical, and maybe you have your hands in the dirt all the time, but maybe also you end up with like chronic pain, a limp, and like back problems, some of which I have from working in the trades. So I just wonder, like, how does that have to do with, does that have anything to do with your experience? Is that like something that's going on behind the scenes, or does it come up in your book?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that those are really great observations and comments. And I'm aware of the kind of romanticization and mythification of rural life that you're talking about. And often that kind of romanticization, well, I mean, that romanticization is often promulgated by books like mine, right? Of which there are actually quite a few of. Oh, yeah, and then there's Thoreau too, right? Of course. Right, yeah. So, so there are a lot of narratives out right now about people who come from the city. This whole back to the land movement that I referenced, right? These were people, young people in the 70s who came to rural Maine from New York and other places. And they weren't, I don't know what kind of class background they came from, but they were intellectuals, they were educated, they were culture makers, right? And they came to Rockland and Farmington and all kinds of other places and started, growing their own food and keeping animals, and started building communities in rural areas. And certainly they were not natives to these places, right? They weren't the lobster fishermen, and they weren't the loggers. They came and did many other things, like teach at universities, for instance, or work at libraries, or work in museums, or start nonprofit organizations, or whatever. So I think it's really important to recognize that there are these stories that romanticize rural life and romanticize back to the land life. It's a thing, it's all over TikTok, right? In fact, when I was trying to figure out how to create a platform, because publishers want you to have a platform for a book, I thought, I am hopeless at this. How am I going to create a platform? I barely know how to use Facebook. And I had this young student who said, you need to get on TikTok, because there's this really cool thing on TikTok. It's called Cabin Core. You guys know about this Cabin Core? It's young people are wanting to go out to the woods and live without utilities and learn how to do things like make jam and heat with wood, right? So all I can say is that I do write about some of those things in this book, and I write about some about class issues in rural life, and I write about relationships with rural neighbors who clearly think, you know, that we are interlopers in their midst. I mean, we did live there for 20 years. And we did successfully raise goats and have gardens, and we employed lots of our rural neighbors and were friends with lots of our rural neighbors. So all I think is that it's complicated, and it's good to reveal the complexity of these things. To just write a book about how awesome it is to raise your own chickens, I think isn't all that interesting, you know? But I've been thinking a lot about, you know, rural life in the United States and urban life, or rural and urban life all over the world, right? Rural life is different than urban life. What does rural life have going for it? You know, whoever you are living in a rural community, what are its gifts and what are its challenges? And how does your living in this rural environment help you see the world in different ways? And what lessons does it impart for you that maybe you share with others, maybe, you know, through books or writing or teaching, or maybe you don't. But certainly the experience in 21st century America of living in a place without utilities, right? In a rural environment has some joys and many challenges. So, you know, I'd be interested in what others of you might have to say about this and what you think about it. Because it's complicated. It's complicated and it's interesting. Yeah, go ahead. No. So does any of that, I mean, it's not an answer.
You're right, it's not an answer.
Yeah.
It's like a discussion question.
Right.
But you always worked too. You didn't write about being fully self-sufficient, really,
No.
right? So they were always, her partner was an electrician and you were teaching at the time,
Right.
pretty much. So you always had to have another source of income.
Absolutely.
Because there's that where you're gardening and enhancing your groceries with your own stuff. And then there's full on, you know, being on your own.
Right.
And being alone too versus having a partner, and some of it can be so hard, and
Yeah.
to do it full time hardcore is
Right.
no joke, and not what you're talking about
Right.
either, right?
Right.
Because that's a next level, it seems like.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Can I ask just a simple basic question about
Sure.
life when you were living on the farm?
Yeah.
Were you, did you have health insurance? How did that
Yes.
work? Okay.
So, no, I was, since I came to Maine, I've been teaching at the University of Maine Farmington. So I teach creative writing in English. And so, yeah, I had health insurance and was also a very healthy person, more or less, barring an injury here or there. Yeah. So this is not a book about, you know, this isn't Louise Dickinson Rich's We Took to the Woods, right? Where we're killing a moose. We have to kill a moose every year or we'll starve. That's not the kind of book it is. Although I really enjoyed Louise Dickinson Rich's work and other work like it, that's not the kind of life that I could live, right? And most of us live lives in between, in these liminal zones between one thing and another, right? And of course, living in rural Maine and then having lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts for 3 years has given me really a new appreciation for what it's like to all the joys of living in rural Maine and the gifts of living in rural Maine and the gifts of being able to have access to a larger city with its, you know, cultural infrastructure, right? Public transportation, right, exactly.
Forgive me, I haven't read the book. Did you, so you don't live on the farm anymore? You sold it, I
Yeah, this
presume,
was
or?
the prequel before you came.
Oh, okay, sorry.
We sold it so that I could go to divinity school. And, you know, it broke my heart to sell it, but it wasn't the wrong thing to do. It still broke my heart, but it wasn't the wrong thing to do, because I get to do something different now. And my partner and I have a little house in the town, in the village of Farmington, kind of on the outskirts of town. So we actually have some space, and we're doing our best to turn it into a farm. You know, we haven't really figured out exactly how much we can do, whether we could actually have, whether we could actually have goats. We'll see. We'll have to check the local municipal code. That's right. Right.
And real quick, you mentioned hard cider, so I'm wondering, do you drink beer? And if so, what's your favorite brewery in the Farmington area?
Oh, you know,
Tumbledown?
are you with Tumbledown?
No, but I like.
Oh, yeah, Tumbledown is a great brewery, right? There's so many great Maine beers. So, and the cider that I was making in this book actually turned to vinegar. And the question about that was, you know, I had put all that time into making this cider, and it finally turned to vinegar. Was my labor lost? You know, so that was the question. It's a question about labor and value and wealth. So, other questions, other observations about the joys and challenges of rural living?
Can you talk a little bit about the violence? Because that really struck me, and something that I struggle with animal husbandry is the violence.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, there's violence all the time. A weasel gets into the chicken coop, right? And you come out in the morning to feed the chickens, and all of your chickens are dead. That kind of thing. It's just that kind of grotesque, gratuitous animal violence, right? Why did that weasel get in my chicken coop, and why did they wreak havoc like this? And they didn't even eat anything, right? And then there's this different kind of violence when the fox comes and takes the chicken, but at least the fox eats the chicken, right? So I ponder things like that. And I was having this, we were having this struggle keeping our goats in our fence. We had an electric fence. We're having trouble keeping the goats in. And so I asked for advice from my rural neighbors, and they all gave me different kind of advice. And one piece of advice was to make what's called a poker. It's a stick with a Y on it. And then you put a bar across the top so that the goat can't get through the fence. The little prongs of the poker stick to the fence. So none of that worked. We had what are called what they refer to as jumpers. But in the effort to educate the goats about the fence, one of the pieces of advice I was given was to wet down the goats and then touch their noses to the electric fence. Which was, so I write about that and how awful that is. And it reminded me of this wonderful story called, I'll remember it in a minute, but it was written, it's about a country doctor, and I'll remember it all in just a minute. Who wrote The Red Wheelbarrow, the poem? No. Everything depends on a red wheelbarrow beside the white chickens glazed with rainwater. Okay, none of us remember. Anyway, he was a country doctor, and he was going around checking children for some terrible disease that you could see if you could diphtheria, and this little girl wouldn't open her mouth. And he struggled and struggled and struggled and struggled with her, and finally pried her mouth open, and she had a red throat, so she had diphtheria. But that the time with the, well, William Carlos Williams, yes, thank you. This experience with the goats reminded me of that, you know, this enacting this violence on another creature for their own good, right? So I never did that again. I learned eventually we had a different kind of a fence installed. It was a page wire fence that they couldn't get through. So that's the kind of violence I'm talking about. And also this, you know, not having to, but choosing to butcher chickens or cull a flock that has too many roosters in it. And this is something that people have done for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, right? They cull their flocks, they manage their flocks, they make coq au vin with their extra roosters. And so I write about what it's like to try to get ready to do something like that, how I would prepare myself to do something like that. And how in the process of doing things like that and understanding how traumatic it is, well, for the animal, of course, as well, but I'm talking about traumatic for the human. I understood more profoundly why it was so important to have rituals around that kind of thing. Rituals of gratitude and thanks. So, and then there's always the violence of machines, chainsaws and axes and wood splitters. I don't know if any of you noticed, but yeah, this is fairly recent. So I'm still splitting wood. I don't know how much longer I'll split wood, but I've done some readings with this wonderful poet, Julia Bausma, who's our Maine poet laureate. And Julia and I have talked a lot about this, the kind of intimate and often difficult interactions you have as a person living a rural life, especially if you're raising animals and using equipment that could harm you, right? And I don't have an answer to this question. I just know that I think it's important to think about. And I say maybe too blithely in this book that I've struggled to. A lot of people really find it abhorrent that that anyone would raise their own animals and then eat them. And I've thought, you know, deeply about that. And I don't have any prescriptions for anyone else, but in my life, I've decided that if I am going to eat meat, I think it's for me, it feels more ethically sound to have a relationship with that animal. And it's very painful when the times when we decided this goat is going to be butchered so that we can put it in our freezer and eat it for the winter. And I feel like that moment of difficulty is what brings us into these moral spaces where we get to make decisions like that with our whole heart, right? So.
There was such a softness in your book, and I get lulled into like this softness and the light filtering in and the hay and the warm breath of the animals. And I said, yes, all of that. And then there's the underside of that, and it just seems all very visceral. And I think that's what gave it so much value to me. But also the relationship aspect and that story. I'm so grateful to read something that reflects my life and the people I love. And almost the questions and conflicts happening there are the violence of the animals and running the farm. There seems to be some rhythm to it. And then sometimes with the conflict and relationship
Huh, it's an interesting comment. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
I see on the Zoom, Gabrielle has a hand raised. You can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask if you like. I think
Hi,
I have the
Gabrielle.
volume up there. Let me see.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Um, I have a question. Woodsqueer, the title Woodsqueer, really for me as a queer person, that is really what came to mind. And I guess my question really has to do with that and your relationship to being a rural person, but more specifically, like being a lesbian in rural Maine. What was your experience like? Did you experience homophobia? Do you experience that? How does that inform your life, and how did it inform your life? And then my second question is really like, who's the audience that you wrote this book for? Those are my questions. Thanks.
Oh, such softball questions. Thanks, Gabrielle. So audience, that's a really good question. I think I can safely say that I don't, that I write for an audience of people who I write for a friendly, thoughtful, curious, and intelligent reader. So when I write, I imagine everybody from somebody sitting on a farm in rural Maine to somebody sitting in an apartment in New York City. So I write for people who are curious about the world. So it's an interesting question about audience. But when it comes to publishing a book, right? No, I won't go so far as to say I write for myself, because I don't write for myself. I write because I'm interested in something, but I also write because I think there are people out there who are curious about life, who are suffering, who appreciate mirrors to their own experience. So there's always a reader out there for me. But it's not a specific audience, as in I wrote this book for queer people, or I wrote this book for people who eat meat, or I wrote this book for people who like to garden. But that said, when you get to the point in time when you're publishing a book, the publisher will say, who's your audience? And you have to provide them with pages and pages and pages of ideas for who this book might possibly appeal to. So then you come up with things like, oh, anybody who's a member of Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, people who live off the grid, people who raise dairy goats. So then teachers, college professors, women's studies professors, environmental policy and planning people, then you go on and on and on. So I can't really answer that question in a very sexy way, but the question about what it's like to be queer in a rural area is a really good one. And I write about it quite a bit in the book. And there's one specific episode that I write about or two specific episodes that I write about that I think give a flavor for what this life was like for me and Ruth on this little country road, outside of Farmington. We decided we were going to put on a dance at New Year's. And we put flyers, and it was going to be a women's dance, because we had done this when we lived in Alaska and people really liked it. So we put out all these flyers all over town, and we rented this little hall, and we hung twinkly lights up. And hundreds of people showed up for this dance. And most of them were lesbians. And they were all dressed in their best jeans and sweaters and vests. And we had a great time. And we found out that 6 of them were our neighbors on the road we lived on. And we had no idea, right? So that was a bit of a surprise, right? That there are queer people living in rural Maine that, you know, you would never know. And that they come and that they had never gotten themselves together in community because there aren't very many opportunities to do so. So that was one of the realizations for me, is that community is hard to create in a rural community, I think, period. But also for people who might think of themselves as being queer or on the margins for some reason. So another experience that we had is that one day I was in downtown Farmington and I found this flyer on my windshield, and it was an invitation to an out to dinner potluck. And this was some enterprising person in our town who had gotten together this potluck for gays and lesbians in our community. And again, we went to this potluck and found all these people that we didn't know existed. So again, you know, another lesson about community and building community. So we were pretty under the radar in terms of our life in this rural environment. We did, when Maine had those referendums about gay rights on the ballot, we did have our sign out that said vote no on one or vote yes on one or whatever it was that year, right? And our neighbors down the street who were more conservative than we are had the opposite sign in their yard, right? So there was a sort of battle of the signs going on. And we don't really know if people knew we were lesbians or not, but they did. One day we found this graffiti on our mailbox and our garbage can that we put down at the end of the road. And it was a bunch of male genitalia in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. And we got really worried that this was somebody who knew that we were lesbians and was being homophobic. And we both got kind of scared by that, and I write about it in the book. But I asked our friend who was a local pediatrician and who was gay, and I said, what would you do if this had happened to you? And he said, I would take pictures of it, but I wouldn't call the police, and I wouldn't get in touch with this kid's mother, because I think I know who did it. He said, and then he said, just take pictures of it and wait and see what happens. And then he said, you know, young men get to this point in their lives, and I hope this doesn't offend any of you guys, where they just like to draw penises on things. So, so that's what Richard thought. But, you know, so I want to say that we didn't outwardly experience a lot of instances of homophobia, but that's just to say that we didn't experience that. That's not to say that it didn't exist for other people and that it's not a part of how our culture works. So, Gabrielle, that's a good question. Where do you live, Gabrielle? Are you live in a rural environment too, I assume?
I live in Monroe.
Yeah. Don't know where Monroe
Don't know where Monroe is, but
Okay. What's your experience been, Gabrielle?
My experience, I would say that my experience living here is complex. I think that there are a lot of ways in which I experience homophobia. And yeah, I would say that it's definitely a part of my life, and it's certainly something that informs decision-making processes. Yeah, things about visibility, safety. Yeah, it's certainly something I think about, and it's certainly something that yeah, it's just a part of my life as a queer person in a very visibly queer relationship.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks.
I heard you say you moved from Alaska to Maine, and I'm curious what other states you and Ruth lived in and what your experiences were there versus Maine, because to me, Mainers really mind their own business, and it's not that way more in the Midwest. And I'm just curious what your experiences are in other states.
Yeah. When we were living in Alaska, we were living in Anchorage, not in rural Alaska. And Anchorage had a very vibrant and active gay and lesbian queer community. So just in terms of the community aspect of having a group of other people who are like you and support you and have your back, we had that in Anchorage in a way that we do in Maine, but it's different, smaller, quieter. Yeah.
I think I have a comment and then a question. The comment is like just thinking about the different types of violence, and I'm thinking about like animals, and like I had an extra rooster, so I brought it home and ate it with my family a couple months ago. My family lives a while away, and my mom eats meat all the time, but she was really like, no, that's so sad. We can't do that. You've been sending me pictures of these chickens for so long. I can't. And to me, that's actually not violence, or it's not extra violence. It's actually just acknowledging the violence that is necessary for someone to eat a chicken, which she does all the time, just doesn't really want to see it and doesn't want to acknowledge that it had a whole life before it landed on her plate. And to me, that part doesn't, I mean, I don't want to get into the weeds about eating meat or not, but that part doesn't feel like violence to me. That feels like acknowledgement of life and death, or like death as the necessary corresponding thing that like corresponds to life. And then I was thinking about how you said like volunteer chaplaincy.
Mhm.
And to me, I'm like pulling strings there about like death and, you know, reality of death. And then also wondering if this is my question part. Well, maybe I'll go back for a second. I think to me, there is like a different experience of violence in living rurally that's like for me, transitioning like going through a gender transition, like in front of a rural community where like there are people in my town who like know me by my old name and like the different way that I used to act. And then I'm like still in all of those same relationships, and I'm like changing my name and showing up differently. Like that's really difficult and vulnerable. And to me, there is like a question mark on if there is violence that's coming at me in being trans in a very small town. It's not Rockland. And then also like with friends, sometimes I've definitely been hanging out with people who are trans in a different way from me. And I need to ask before I like walk away or leave them alone because of the realities of like what might happen to them. So I do think there is kind of this like quiet threat of violence, even in like liberal pockets in Maine, that can be really scary. And to when someone talked about the violence of rural life, that's what I thought. I didn't really think about my roosters. And then the question that I was getting at is about service. Like, is there an element of service? Was there an element of service like in your relationship to your community? Or is there an element of service in your divinity school work now? Or like, was that already there in your rural community? Is it in your relationship to Farmington? Can you talk about that? Like service to, I don't know if what I'm saying if service makes sense, but like throwing down for your community or something like that. Does that make sense?
I don't think I quite understand the question. I think, are you talking about service related to being queer, or service?
More like the concept of giving back, I guess.
Yeah.
Or
Well,
maybe like you said, ministry, right?
yes.
Like how the way in which one, like pizza ministry or garden ministry.
Right. Yeah. I definitely feel like this. So what I did when I came back to Farmington was some of you already heard this, that I started a garden on our campus. And the motto of the garden is, dig it, bring the farm back to Farmington. And I feel like one of the things I'm doing, and it's hard, and like nobody really cares about having a vegetable garden on the college campus, given all the other things that are going on in public higher education right now. Like, I am the garden's champion. It wouldn't be there if it wasn't for me. I don't get paid to do it, but there's something that is very, very important to me about doing this, which is giving young people an opportunity to understand something important about the web of life and the food they eat. One of the magical things about the garden on our campus is that all of the food waste from the dining hall gets composted locally, and then the soil in our garden on campus comes from food, that compost. So the food, so it gets recycled. And I've been really surprised at how many of these Maine kids have never planted anything or harvested anything, or have ever eaten something that they picked from a garden. And that's sort of an assumption that people have about rural life. If you grow up in rural Maine, you should know how to do those things. But these young people don't. And I feel like that's a giving back to the community. Through this garden, I'm connected with local farmers, and trying to weave this connection between our campus and our community. So connecting students with local farmers and local farms, with food banks. So we this garden doesn't produce much. It produces about 100 pounds of vegetables a year, and that includes a couple really big pumpkins, so it's not that much food. But just trying to create this opportunity for students, especially young people, who, my experience is, many of the students I advise and teach at the University of Maine Farmington are completely overwhelmed with life as we know it. And my firm belief is that a connection to soil and plants and other living things and the food that comes from them is a healing exercise in lots of different ways. Not only does it heal the spirit, but it also helps a person connect with one small thing, the seed that can be put in the soil, that can grow something meaningful to produce food for another living being. So that's the service that I'm thinking that I'm undertaking. We'll see. So we're getting towards 7:30, but there's another question. Yeah.
Actually, it's not a question. I just want to tell about my life.
Yes, yes.
I lived with my mother for 20 years on an island off of Friendship, Maine, with no electricity or running water, and cooking and heating with wood. And I started out there when I was 29 and she was 55 or so. And she just passed away 2 months ago at 91, but she was able to stay out there till her last month with my help. Anyway, I'm a painter, and I'm a painter of the woods. And it's been my life study, really. But even though I went to art school, I never really became an artist until I lived on that island and experienced the light and how it changed through the seasons without electricity. And the cycle of the light, I never would have experienced that if I hadn't lived without electricity, and how immense the winter night is. And we would sleep for 12 hours a night, partly to keep warm and partly just because it was so dark. It got dark at 4 and didn't get light till 7. And then how the light comes flooding back in the spring, and then at high summer, and then it goes down and down in the fall, and the shadows are. And so I'm still painting in the woods, and I'm still learning. And that is one of the gifts that the rural life gave me. And it was, there's different struggles about being a painter as opposed to being a writer and showing your work, and people telling you what's important, and, or not important, and trying to go your own way. And, you're not going to ever show in New York, but that's the center of the art world. And supposedly, if you're not there, what you're doing isn't important. But of course, I don't believe that really, but you get these messages all the time. So that's what rural life has done for me. And I loved many of the things that you read tonight, and I'm going to get your book, not here, but I'll get it at Hello Hello.
Oh, wonderful.
And I really, many things that you said touched me, and I appreciate your openness and vulnerability. So thanks.
Thank you for sharing that story. Your beautiful description of light.
Excellent. Well, that is a fantastic note to transition into book getting and getting signed period. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us in person and via Zoom, and for all your wonderful questions and comments. And thanks so much to Gretchen for joining us tonight. Thank you.